What's going on, guys? It's the Filthy Casual, back with another video. Today we're looking at how to do more damage in Diablo 3. This guide is aimed at newer or returning players, and hopefully it will be useful as a refresher to some of the game mechanics and let you know how to gear your character out to do the most amount of damage possible. Now, if you're a new player, this should help you in constructing builds in early game, help you put together your own LON builds if you fancy some off-meta stuff, and also help you with your item rerolls as to which stat to choose on which piece of gear. As always, I want this to be user friendly, so there will be links in the description for a couple of videos that I'm going to mention that I've used for my resources for this. And those videos are quite old now from Quinn69, but they are still pretty good. In terms of damage, we're going to be looking at it holistically, so not just the number on your sheet, not just the number that the game suggests when dropping you a weapon or item, and in fact the crux of this video should show that actually sometimes your sheet damage can go up, but your character damage can actually go down. Same goes for picking up an item. The game can tell you it's an upgrade, but actually it might not be the case. So hopefully in a new player friendly and casual way, we will be covering the following areas: multipliers, weapon damage, criticals, area damage, attack speed, cooldown reduction, resource cost reduction, and then finally Thorns. Before we jump in, if you like Diablo 3 content, build videos, tips and tricks, discussion, news, then subscribe and make sure you turn notifications on. So let's start with the most important thing, multipliers. This game is initially about stacking multipliers, and this is how builds function in the game. They get as many multipliers together and they get them as high as individually on their stat rolls as possible. So let's say, for example, we're going to deal 100 points worth of damage just to keep the numbers round. If we have 5 multipliers that all double our damage, then we do 100 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. And we now deal 3,200, or 32 times what we did before we had the multipliers. Now let's say we increase one of those multipliers to 200%, i.e. a 3 times multiplier, and another one to say 300%, which would be a 4 times increase. Then we have 100 times 3 times 4 times 2 times 2 times 2, which is 9,600, or 96 times what we originally dealt, or roughly about 3 times greater multiplier than what we started with. Now what would happen if we lost 2 of those double multipliers? So we'd have 100 times 3 times 4 times 2, which would be 2,400, which would only be 24 times. So as you can see very quickly, if you add or take multipliers away, it drastically affects the build, because even though we've only taken out 2 double multipliers, we've come crashing down from 96 down to 24. That's kind of how the game works. You need to stack multipliers on top of multipliers. Obviously, it just makes common sense. If you're going to multiply 2 figures together, you need those figures to be as high as possible to get the most benefit. Now, this is where set bonuses come in. Generally speaking, they're going to be the highest multipliers in the game you can get your hand on, and that's why when you get your 6-piece bonus, you become so much more powerful than beforehand. Now hopefully what this will illustrate is that it is much better to actually have a multiplier in a build rather than have an item that simply does more damage. So if, for example, I have a Tragul's Corroded Fang and a curse on my bar as a Necromancer, I'll be getting a 200% multiplier, up to 200% multiplier, so I'm much better keeping that weapon than, let's say, picking up a random 2-handed axe that's got no multiplier, even though the game may tell me that it does more damage, and I'm going to be dealing more damage if I pick this up. Because unfortunately, multipliers don't show on your sheet, so you're not going to be able to see the benefit of having the multiplier. Now obviously, as we showed earlier in the example, multipliers stack, and the more that you can get on top of each other, each one really does boost the damage up quite a lot. Now as I said, the set multipliers are pretty high, so for example if you look at a Narius, that's 10,000, that's a pretty huge multiplier. Also main stat is a multiplier, so the more that you have, the bigger the damage is multiplied by this, so that's why augments are so important, it's why Paragon is so important. You really can get an awful lot of damage out of your main stat. So when you break it down, there are actually loads of different multipliers in this game. You can get elemental damage multipliers on your bracelet, on your amulet, on your Stone of Jordan, on your Swampland Raiders. You can get skill damage like Death Nova damage on your helm, or on your boots, or on your offhand. But when choosing individual rolls, you need to bear in mind that these multipliers are added together before being multiplied. So what I mean by that is the elemental damage will be added together before it's multiplied. So if we go back to 100 damage, if let's say we've got 20% poison on an item, then that's going to take our damage from 100 to 120. We've gone up 20%. If let's say we want to roll another 20% poison on a different gear piece, that's going to take us from 120 to 140. Now that's not a 20% increase, in fact it's only a 16% increase, because 120 times by 1.16 is 140. So we need to bear this in mind when we're adding. So we'd only actually gain 16% extra damage, so therefore it might not necessarily be such a hot gear roll to take. We might be able to take a different roll that will actually boost up our damage more. If let's say we want to put on another 20% worth of poison, well, we're going from 140 to 160, and this is now only a 14% increase, because 140 times by 1.14 is 160. So each time we add to an individual multiplier, we get a kind of reduction in value. So the damage still goes up, it's not bad to have, but we don't get that full 20%. And this is the same for skill damage. So there's kind of almost like a diminishing return effect for the multipliers. The more that you add on to an individual multiplier, the less impact it kind of makes. Now the game is absolutely full of multipliers. You've got things like Bane of the Trapped, Bane of the Powerful, Strong Arm Braces. So some depend on specific acts, like Strong Arms, you've got to knock an enemy back for it to apply. You've got to proc the effect somehow. This is one of the reasons why Juggernauts are so difficult to deal with in the game, because they're immune to CC, so therefore they can't be slowed. So the Bane of the Trap multiplier doesn't apply to them. And it's even worse for Necro, because they can't be frozen or stunned to get the Crispin's proc. Now, as I said, you want to be stacking as many multipliers on top of each other as you can, but what you need to bear in mind is that sometimes a well-rolled non-ancient piece will be better than an ancient one. So multipliers often roll on a range, so again, if we take Tragul's Corroded Fang as an example, that rolls from 150 to 200%. That's a 33% difference. So you take 150, you multiply it by 1.33, you get to 200. So if you've got a max rolled 200% non-ancient, and then you find one that gives you extra 20% damage, so it's ancient, so your damage goes up 20%, but the secondary roll is only 150. Well, if you swap them, your sheet damage goes up, the damage on the weapon looks higher, but actually you're going to cost yourself some damage. So bear in mind, ancient isn't always better. But guys, just in case I haven't made it clear enough, the basic rule: get as many multipliers as you can in a build, never take one out of a build, and secondary, try and get them as high as possible, especially where there's a wide range on them. Now honestly guys, if that's your only takeaway, then that's going to be pretty good, but we'll move on to the next topic, which is going to be weapon damage. Now if the game drops you a weapon, it'll let you know if it does more damage. Is that helpful? Well, not really. Unfortunately, the game scales off both damage and attack speed. So when you look at a weapon, you've got that big number at the top, that's going to be your damage per second, so it's your damage multiplied by attack speed. Now actually, skills and things that you deal damage with scale off the smaller number underneath, so this is your damage range, and you want to make sure that this is as high as possible. So for some weapons, you might pick it up, the game might tell you it's actually going to be a damage increase, but it might actually put your damage down, because you need to be looking at that damage range, and you want that as high as possible. So that's the basic rule: pick a weapon with the highest damage range that you can find. So moving on to criticals, so by maxing out critical hit chance and critical hit damage in your build, you can get about treble damage. You want to get a balance of about 10 to 1, so your critical hit damage should be about 10 times bigger than your critical hit chance. A big mistake that I used to make as a newer player is you'd be drawn to ancient items and you'd maybe pick them over ones that have got critical hit chance and critical hit damage on them. It's a mistake. You want to make sure that these things are maxed out as quickly as possible. Now obviously there are some builds that are quite unique, so for example an Inarius Bonestorm Necro that uses Pain Enhancer, then you're going to want to focus on critical hit chance, because the Pain Enhancer is going to cause damage when it crits, so crit hit chance will be prioritised over critical hit damage. Conversely, you may be pushing with a Cold Lance Necro, in which case Cold Lance has got an increasing stacking crit effect, so your crit chance goes up with every hit, so therefore you'd want to prioritise crit hit damage. So just make sure you're familiar with your build that you're using, make sure there's nothing funny about it, but generally speaking you want this as 10 to 1. So crits are pretty straightforward, aim for a 10 to 1 ratio, and obviously you want them both to be as high as possible. Now moving on, we're going to cover area damage, and this is probably one of the most underrated skills in the game. Now when you hit a target, there's a 20% chance you'll proc area damage. This means that all enemies with a hitbox inside the 10-yard radius of the enemy that you've just hit will take area damage, and this is the same as the value of the area damage on your sheet. Now it can be ranged, and the radius goes from the enemy hit. So if you hit an enemy within 10 yards if area damage procs, which as I say is 20%, then any enemy within 10 yards of the initial strike will take area damage. Now if it does proc, the game will apply your damage figure multiplied by your area damage. So if you've got 50% area damage on your sheet, half of your initial hit will be applied individually to every enemy within 10 yards. So it deals your initial damage number, so if you crit, then the damage for the area proc includes your crit, albeit it doesn't flash up as an actual crit hit. Now interestingly, area damage can be over 100%, so if for example you have 150% area damage, well you'll be dealing 150% of your initial hit to every enemy that's in that area damage range, so area damage can actually hit harder than your initial strike. Now unfortunately the 20% proc chance can't be increased, but it is individual. So by that I mean that if you hit 10 enemies with an attack, on average 2 of them you'd expect to get an area damage proc, so you can get really big procs for things that have got AoE. So area of effect, so like Grim Scythe, if you swipe away and hit 5 or 6 enemies, you're much more likely to get 1 or 2 area damage procs. The same for Earthquake on Barbarian, if you can dump a lot of area of effect damage down, then it can proc on many enemies, and sometimes you can do 2-3 times the amount of damage just from your area damage proc. Now also on a side note guys, pets can also proc area damage, so that's why you see it with Gargantuan a lot in Witch Doctor. It's got a big cleave attack, it hits lots of enemies at once, thus increasing the chance that you'll get an area damage proc, because obviously 20% chance times by the number of enemies, the more enemies you hit, the more likely you're going to get a proc. So as it can go over 100%, it really does shine if you can get density and if you can hit lots of enemies, and if you get that kind of scenario, it really is one of the best stats in the game. Again, it's another one that's hidden, it doesn't show on your sheet damage. As a noob, I was really reluctant to roll area damage on gear because it just made me feel like I was doing less damage, but trust me, it really does work. It makes an awful lot of difference for the right build. Downside of area damage, it's totally useless against single target. It's only the area around the initial target that takes area damage, so if you hit a target, it can't then suffer its own area damage. So you'll tend to find these types of builds will be paired with Bane of the Stricken to try and kill the Rift Guardian and mitigate this. Quinn69's done a great video on area damage. It's about 4 or 5 years old. I'll link it in the description. So if you want to see how big a radius 10 yards is, or you want to see any more details, then go and check that video out. Basic rule of area damage, it's amazing for AoE and density, and it's useless against single target. Now we're going to move on to attack speed. This is another really tricky one because this will definitely increase your sheet damage, but it won't always necessarily translate into more damage on your character. So attack speed is how quickly you perform an attack or how many attacks per second your character can make. So in theory, you just think, well, I want this as high as possible, but not so fast. Some builds get great value out of attack speed and others get none. So as I say, it definitely increases your sheet damage, but bear in mind that lots of skills have what are called breakpoints. And what that means is that unless you reach a specific attacks per second number, the skill doesn't actually register as attacking any quicker, and thus you don't actually deal any more damage until you get past that next breakpoint. So the main example I can think of this is Cold Lance for the Necro. So if you add an attack speed roll to a build and you don't reach the next breakpoint, whilst your sheet damage goes up, unfortunately you haven't actually increased the damage of your character at all. In fact, you've probably hurt your character because you've taken the option away from another damaging stat, maybe like main stat or crit or something like that. When factoring in attack speed, you also need to consider resource. If your build has a high resource cost, then higher attack speed is likely to have you running out of essence, mana, fury. You're going to run out of juice and you're going to have to stop attacking. That's going to bring your overall damage down. Now another point about attack speed is it's really useful for builds that look to apply on-hit effects. So for example, Pain Enhancer, Zodiac procs, maybe you've got life on hit and you want to be attacking really quickly for that. Maybe it's a Thorns application build. So check the build guide, make sure that you're hitting the breakpoints and find out whether attack speed is recommended or not. Now we come to what I think is probably one of the most powerful stats in this game. Unfortunately, it's cooldown reduction. Now this certainly is a way of increasing your damage that doesn't register on your sheet. Obviously cooldown doesn't give you any damage directly, but it allows you more uptime on buffs, or it gives you more casts of damaging skills. So using the Necro again as an example, Land of the Dead. It's a skill that freezes the whole screen and gives you infinite amount of corpses. Necro also has a ring that lets you deal 300% extra damage against frozen enemies, for example, so the more times you can press this in a rift, the more damage you're going to do. It's on a huge cooldown of 120 seconds, so the higher you can push your CDR number, the more damage you'll be able to output, because you'll just simply be able to press the button and activate it more often. Now, some abilities have breakpoints on cooldown, so for example, an Akan Condemned Crusader, if you get to a certain level of cooldown reduction, you'll have permanent uptime on Akarat's champion, and that will allow you to take the damage buff from that skill and whatever rune you've gone for as well for the entirety of the rift. So again, you need to check your build guides. How much CDR does the content creator recommend? Am I hitting that point? And obviously sometimes the last little bit can be the one that unlocks all the value. So if you got an extra cooldown roll on your Akan Condemned Crusader that meant perma uptime, your life would be a lot easier. Now CDR isn't additive, it's multiplicative. So if you take two 10% cooldown reduction items and put them on your character and you have no other CDR, you don't get 20%, you get 19%. So the way to think about it is if you've got 100% and that's your normal skill cast, once you take 10% cooldown off, it goes down to 90. If you then take a further 10% off 90, you get to 81%. Obviously you have to flip that round, and that's where your 19% CDR comes in. Now this is a tricky one because it looks like the value of CDR diminishes, because each CDR roll you put on, this percentage on your sheet gets smaller and smaller. So by the end of it, you're adding 6 or 8%, but it's only showing up like 2 or 3% cooldown. Actually, that's a little bit of an illusion, and it is actually increasing in effectiveness because it's set against the amount of time between casts, the amount of skills you can use per minute. Again, Quinn did a really good guide on this. There's loads of mathematics and spreadsheets in it, so I'll link it. I'll also link his Google Doc on the subject. But guys, trust me, if you've got a CDR based build, you want this figure as high as possible. It really will make your life easier. It will improve your damage output tremendously. And don't listen to your sheet. It is worth rolling those extra cooldown rolls, even if it looks like it isn't. Now on a side note, there are some items in the game that take a set number of seconds off a cooldown. For example, the Golem Skin Breaches, or maybe an Ingeome Sword. Now this is something that I really didn't understand when I first started playing the game, but the way it works is the seconds are taken off the skill first, and then your cooldown reduction is applied. So for example, if you've got 50% CDR and an Ingeome with a 10-second roll on it, and let's say you've got a skill that has got a 12-second cooldown, well the 10 seconds is taken off the 12, so that now becomes a 2-second cooldown skill. Once your Ingeome is procced, you then apply your 50% CDR, so it's a cast every 1 second. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that the 50% CDR is applied to the 12-second skill, and then the 10 seconds for the Ingeome. Now practically that means for some classes the 10-second roll on the Ingeome might not be as applicable as to others, but again it depends what it is you're trying to reduce with your cooldown. In general, 10 seconds is going to be best if you've got any longer skills than 10 seconds. So in terms of build creation, you've got to look out for skills, passives, items, gear rolls, gems, whatever it is that can reduce CDR, because as I say, it is definitely one of the most powerful stats in the game. Now this brings us nicely to resource cost reduction. The previous video from Quinn that I mentioned, it also covers RCR. It works exactly the same as CDR, it's just a different concept, it just applies to a different figure. So it multiplies just like CDR, and obviously it only applies to skills when you're spending a resource. So if you're playing something like a Wave of Light Monk, if you run out of spirit, then you can't deal any damage, so you're going to need some form of resource cost reduction. Again, you need to remember the more RCR you have, the more powerful it becomes. The benefits don't diminish, even if it looks like that on your sheet. Trust me, the more you have, the more damage output you can do. Now again, with a lot of builds, you'll reach what's called a breakpoint, whereby you will reach a level where you won't be able to spend your resource quick enough. And once you get to that point where you find that you're not running out of the resource, then you don't need to add any more RCR because it's not actually helping you. If you do find that you're still running dry, then obviously you might want to up your RCR figure again, and that should help you out. So again, it's not another direct damage, but it allows you to output more damage, so it is a consideration. And lastly, we get to Thorns. Now Thorns is its own weird mechanic, and it is essentially reflective damage. When an enemy hits you, there's a chance your Thorns will proc, and it scales off your Thorns value and off your main stat, but importantly, it does not scale off your weapon damage. So it doesn't matter how high your weapon damage is, it will not affect your Thorns. Thorns also can't benefit from critical hit chance or critical hit damage, so they are completely wasted stats in a Thorns build. It does however benefit from other multipliers such as physical percent damage on gear, a Tragul's Corroded Fang, or a Rylena's Shadow Hook for a Necro, so you can build some powerful builds even though it doesn't scale off weapon damage. Now Thorns is a secondary roll on your gear. You can also get it from the Boyarski's chip and also from putting a topaz in a weapon. Now in terms of gear, some items can roll up to 9,500, so that's your shoulders, chest piece, belt, shield and amulet. That's really high compared to other Thorn rolls which are generally 3,500. So obviously you need to prioritise those big ones because they're worth kind of 2.5 times or something like that of a smaller Thorns roll. Now one of the advantages of a Thorns build and dealing Thorns damage is that because you're not going for crit hit chance and crit hit damage, you get the opportunity to roll extra defensive stats, so you're generally going to be quite tough and tanky. Now Thorns can be a bit clunky. A lot of the elite affixes have got different proc rates, so sometimes you'll find that an elite will proc your Thorns and die very quickly, and other times you can feel like you're there for ages. Now most of your classic Thorn builds actually apply Thorns, so they'll use the Hack Axe or an Invoker's Crusader where you're applying your Thorns with every attack. Those types of builds will focus on attack speed because it's more about how many hits you can get, and they're normally going to be push builds because you're looking to apply Thorns as many times as possible. Obviously Necro is a bit different because that's got a passive Thorns build whereby your pets are dealing the damage, and that's obviously one of the kind of top builds at the moment. But Thorns, it's pretty chill, stuff hits you and it dies, so it's one of those, it's a bit odd. So that's it guys, it was a whistle stop tour in terms of damage. Hopefully you've got a better idea about how to gear your character out, how to balance your character out and what stats that you should go for it. I've always found the community is a very helpful place, so Reddit, on the forums, if you've ever got any questions about what particular role you should take, there are plenty of people who play this game still, an awful lot, and I'll be more than happy to help you out with any particular roles. But hopefully you'll be able to now gauge whether an item is better or not, and you've got a bit better of an understanding about how some of the damage mechanics work. So I hope you enjoyed the video, a thumbs up is always appreciated. I will catch you in the next video. Peace.
Bye.